Swallowing the black wolfsbane tincture felt exactly like drinking crushed glass, but Evangeline tipped the glass back anyway. Sludge coated her tongue, tasting of copper and dead earth, scraping down her throat like rusted wire. Her fingernails dug into the chipped porcelain of the clinic sink until the beds of her nails turned stark white. She clamped her teeth together. Poisoning her own veins locked the beast inside her away. It kept her breathing. Gasping for oxygen, she choked on the noxious fumes radiating from the drain. The dark herb tore through her system, shoving her inner wolf into a frigid, lightless cage deep in her chest. An icy ache settled into her marrow. A dormant beast kept her off the execution block. If the Southern Alpha ever tasted the ancient, royal Lycan blood running under her skin, she would be dead before nightfall. Just like her parents, tracing the jagged silver scar across her collarbone grounded her against the rising nausea. Blood-painting, pristine snow flashed behind her eyelids. Glowing eyes tore through the winter dark 10 years ago, ripping her family to shreds. Why the Alpha ordered the slaughter of her bloodline remained a mystery, and the unanswered question chewed at her ribs every morning. For an entire decade, she hid in plain sight. Approaching 30 and unmated rendered her completely invisible to the pack. Scrubbing dried blood off the infirmary floor and resetting snapped femurs was her entire existence. Yet, a stubborn ember refused to burn out. 5 years ago, a bleeding warrior crashed onto her examination table. Royal blood could have knit his torn flesh back together in moments. Instead, she tied a pathetic bandage over his throat and watched the life drain out of his eyes. Exposing herself meant trading his life for hers, and the metallic tang of that guilt still coated her mouth today. Wood splintered against plaster as the clinic door hit the wall. Dust rained down from the ceiling rafters. The sharp crack echoed off the sterile tiles, leaving a ringing dial tone in her left ear. She swallowed a mouthful of sour saliva and dragged her sleeve across her lips, wiping away the black stain. A sneering guard leaned into the frame. "The Alpha demands everyone in the Great Hall. It's the mating run ceremony. Move it, healer!" The fluorescent bulb buzzed, the sound loud and grating in the sudden quiet. "I'm coming," she whispered. Snatching a frayed gray sweater from the chair, she wrapped the scratchy wool tight around her ribs. Passing the guard required turning sideways, and the stench of his unwashed uniform mixed violently with the lingering wolfsbane. Taking a step into the lightless corridor, she felt the temperature drop 10 degrees, dragging her toward the exact nightmare she fought so hard to outlive. Shuffling down the freezing stone corridor, the damp air bit at Evangeline's exposed ankles. Every step toward the iron doors of the great hall felt like dragging wet sand. By the time she reached the archway, her pulse hammered against her ribs in a frantic, irregular rhythm. Stifling heat rolled out of the open doorway. The cavernous room choked on the clashing scents of cheap jasmine perfume, charred meat, and the sour sting of desperation. Hundreds of wolves crammed shoulder to shoulder under the chandeliers. Dozens of unmated females stood dead center in skin-tight silk, tossing their curls and angling their necks toward the strongest warriors. Hugging the perimeter, Evangeline pressed her spine against the cold limestone. Staring straight at the floorboards kept her out of the dominant wolves' sightlines. The whispers started before she took a third step. Look who dragged herself out of the clinic. Isn't she almost 30? What is she even doing here? Pathetic. Sharp words sliced through the stagnant air. Burying her fingernails into the meat of her palms, she forced her lungs to expand slowly. 1 count in, 1 count out. She had survived a decade of their venom. Tonight would end, just like the rest. High above the crowd, Alpha Thorn slouched on his velvet throne, surveying his pack like spoiled meat. His dead, flat eyes tracked across the room. Her caged wolf scratched weakly at the bars in her chest. Then, the torches blew out. Iron hinges shrieked. A winter gale ripped through the hall, extinguishing every flame in a split second. The string quartet cut off mid-note. Complete, suffocating silence swallowed the room. Nobody took a breath. A new scent flooded the darkness. Crushed pine needles, ozone, and fresh blood slammed into her sinuses. It carried zero trace of the southern pack. As a single unit, the entire crowd pivoted toward the black doorway. A silhouette blocked the moonlight. Taller and broader than Thorn, the stranger wore a tactical coat, dusted with sleet. He did not growl, he did not flex. The sheer, crushing gravity of his quiet entrance forced 3 young enforcers to drop to the stone floor, their kneecaps cracking against the wood. Evangeline swallowed the dry lump in her throat. Stepping into the ambient light, his eyes ignited. Unhinged, liquid gold tracked across the terrified crowd. He was hunting. Thorn bolted out of his throne, his knuckles white against the armrests. King Silas, the Alpha of the North. You were not invited. The feral warlord, the most lethal shifter alive. Ignoring the Alpha entirely, Silas stepped forward. The crowd parted like water, scrambling over each other to escape his path. His combat boots struck the marble with absolute, terrifying precision. Pressing her shoulders flat against the wall, she dug her heels into the floorboards, calculating the exact distance to the nearest exit before his golden eyes found her. The metallic click of Silas's boots echoed through the vaulted ceiling, hanging in the stagnant air as the crowd held perfectly still. Thorn's desperate voice shattered the tension, his face flushing crimson under the moonlight. "We are in the middle of a ceremony, King Silas," Thorn shouted, pointing a thick, trembling finger straight across the room. Venom coated his next words. "Though some in this room are just wasting space. Look at her. Evangeline!" Silence descended again. Dust motes drifted lazily through the single beam of moonlight. Every head snapped toward the shadowy wall. The Northern King stopped his approach. His neck cracked sharply as he turned. "Come here, healer," Thorn demanded. Her boots suddenly weighed 100 pounds. Defying an Alpha's direct order resulted in a public execution. Dragging her feet across the polished floor, she forced herself into the open center of the hall. She kept her chin tucked, staring at a crack in the marble. 29 years old, Thorn mocked, his voice echoing off the pillars. "No mate, no power. You are too old to be a bride. You are broken. You are nothing." Her knees trembled, threatening to give out completely. The sheer cruelty of his tone stripped away her armor, leaving her entirely exposed. The laughter started in the back row. A lone chuckle turned into a dozen, then erupted into a roaring wave of ridicule. Hundreds of wolves pointed at her frayed sweater. The booming sound scraped against her eardrums, teleporting her straight back to a freezing night 10 years ago. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes. She clamped her teeth together, refusing to let a single drop fall. A low, vibrating hum rattled the floorboards under her feet. The laughter choked off instantly. It wasn't a roar. It was a dark, guttural frequency that cracked the plaster on the nearest column. Enforcers dropped to their bellies, clutching the sides of their heads. Evangeline jerked her chin up. Silas stood 2 feet away. He had crossed the room in absolute silence. Up close, a blistering heat radiated off his combat coat. A single muscle ticked along his clenched jawline. His molten gold eyes locked onto hers, devoid of pity. He stared at her like a starving man looking at a feast. He reached out, calloused. Scarred fingers wrapped around her wrist. Searing heat punched through her skin, shooting straight up her arm. Her ribcage cracked open. The poisoned, dormant wolf inside her screamed, slamming its spectral paws against her ribs. "Take your hands off her!" Thorn took a singular step off his dais. "She belongs to my pack." Silas ignored the Southern Alpha. He stepped into Evangeline's space, his chest brushing the rough wool of her sweater. Bending his neck, he dragged his nose along her jawline, inhaling the scent of her skin. The background noise of the hall faded into static. Fleshy gums pulled back, revealing elongated, lethal canines. He spoke in a low, rusted whisper that vibrated directly into her collarbone. "You're mine." Before her lungs could pull enough air to scream, his arm locked around her waist, lifting her boots entirely off the ground. Silas didn't wait for permission. Iron-hard fingers locked around Evangeline's wrist. He pivoted on his heel, boots scraping against the marble, and dragged her straight toward the archway. Her knees buckled. Leather soles slipped across the polished stone as she fought to keep her balance. The safety of her invisibility vanished in a single heartbeat. Air burned in her lungs. She dug her heels in, scanning the room for an exit, but his grip was unyielding steel. "Stop him!" Thorne shrieked from his elevated velvet chair, his voice cracking. "Kill the northern bastard." Claws clicked frantically against the floorboards. 5 southern enforcers blurred into fur and muscle, lunging for Silas's unprotected back. The northern king didn't even break his stride. He threw his free hand backward. A shockwave of raw kinetic energy detonated in the center of the hall. The 5 charging wolves slammed into the limestone pillars with a sickening snap of bone. Plaster rained down on the floor. A low whine echoed through the dust. The rest of the pack froze in place, staring at the broken enforcers. Thorne stood paralyzed on his dais, his knuckles white against the armrests, watching a foreign king steal his pack healer. Freezing wind slapped Evangeline's face the second they breached the courtyard doors. Sleet bit into her exposed cheeks. Idling in the snowbanks sat an armored transport. The engine rumbled with a low vibration that rattled her teeth. "Get in!" Silas ordered, his voice a jagged scrape of gravel. She planted her feet in the slush. Calculating the distance to the tree line took a fraction of a second, but running meant freezing to death. Memories of another snow-covered night flashed behind her eyes, screams echoing in the woods, blood staining the white powder. A new monster stood before her now. "Please," she rasped, tasting copper on her tongue. He didn't wait for compliance. Calloused hands clamped around her waist. Searing heat bled through her thin sweater right before he hoisted her off the ground and tossed her onto the leather back seat. The reinforced steel door slammed shut. Darkness swallowed her completely as the tires tore into the slush, hurtling her away from the only hell she knew and straight toward an entirely new execution. Tires tore through the icy mountain roads, sliding over packed sleet as the transport climbed higher into the frozen wilderness. The cramped space inside the cabin choked on the scent of dark pine, ozone, and impending violence. Evangeline wedged herself into the farthest corner, pressing her spine flat against the frosted glass. Taking up the opposite side, Silas shifted his frame. He was entirely too big for the metal box. Ambient light from the dashboard cast long shadows across his face as he leaned closer. Burning gold eyes tracked her erratic pulse. "You are shaking!" It was a rumbling statement of fact, vibrating through the floorboards. "I want to go back," she lied, keeping her chin up despite the tremor in her voice. "No, you don't." He leaned into her space, tracking the frantic beating of her heart. "Your alpha humiliated you. He called you useless. Yet you just stood there and took it." Biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted iron, she met his gaze. "I am a healer. Survival requires knowing when to keep quiet." Silas reached across the seats. Instead of grabbing her throat, a single fingertip dragged across the jagged silver scar on her collarbone. Searing heat punched through her skin, shooting electricity straight down to her boots. Tracing his arm, her gaze snagged on an ink-black stain crawling up the side of his neck. Roping veins pulsed under his flesh. It looked like a rotting infection. "You smell wrong," Silas murmured, dragging his nose a fraction of an inch from her pulse point. He inhaled a ragged breath. "I smell the wolfsbane. You are poisoning yourself." "Why?" Her lungs seized. The engine hummed beneath them, filling the suffocating silence. He knew. "I don't," she started, her hands curling into tight fists. "Don't lie to me." The rusted snarl rattled the reinforced windows. Squeezing her eyes shut, she calculated her next move. A cornered animal had to play dead to survive. I take it for the pain, she snapped back, forcing moisture into her eyes. My beast is sick. It hurts to shift. The violent static in the cabin immediately died. The lethal edge in his golden eyes fractured, replaced by a starving hunger. He didn't believe a single word. The muscles in his neck pulled taut. The transport slammed into a hidden pothole. Rubber tires violently launched her forward off the slick leather, throwing her face first into his rock-hard chest, right against the rotting black veins that pulsed with a lethal secret of their own. 4 brutal hours of winding through the blizzard finally ended when the armored transport lurched to a halt. The suspension groaned under the chassis. Evangeline scraped a fingernail against the frosted window pane, peering out into the howling storm. Jagged walls of black stone and solid ice pierced into the starless sky. The northern keep was a fortress built to cage monsters. Steel latches popped. A sub-zero gale ripped into the cabin, instantly freezing the sweat on her neck. Silas stepped out into the knee-deep snow, completely unfazed by the frost. He pivoted, holding a scarred palm toward her. "Take my hand," he instructed, his voice slicing cleanly through the howling wind. Staring at his offered palm, she weighed her odds. Running meant dying in the tundra. Taking his hand meant surrendering to a feral warlord. Setting her teeth, she placed her freezing fingers against his scorching skin. He yanked her down from the running board, instantly tucking her against his ribs to block the brutal wind. Blinking through the sleet, she scanned the perimeter. Dozens of northern enforcers paced the courtyard. They were covered in jagged battle scars, but their postures were entirely wrong. Several warriors were chained to the limestone retaining walls, snapping their jaws at the empty air, their eyes clouded with rabid madness. "What is wrong with them?" she asked, her breath pluming in the freezing air. Silas went completely rigid against her side. "The feral curse." He stared straight ahead. "It eats my pack alive. It takes our minds, it takes our wolves, and it turns us into mindless beasts." The same black veins creeping up his neck matched the infected warriors exactly. The king was dying. "Why did you bring me here?" she challenged, tilting her chin up to meet his feral gaze. Silas looked down, the raging madness in his irises warring with crushing desperation. "Because," he rasped, the sound barely carrying over the storm. "When I stood in that hall tonight, my beast was screaming to slaughter everyone. But the second I smelled you beneath that poison, my mind went completely quiet." A metallic shriek ripped through the courtyard. The reinforced iron gates slammed together with a booming crash, locking her permanently inside a frozen cage with a dying warlord who viewed her as his only cure. Frost coated the iron window frames when dawn finally broke over the northern keep. Surviving the night in the warlord's bed left her bones aching with a deep, penetrating cold. Scraping a thumbnail against her thumb, she choked on the bitter, metallic burn of withdrawal crawling up her esophagus. Without the poisonous tincture in her veins, the caged wolf inside her scratched violently at her ribs. Dragging a gray fur over her shoulders, she slipped her bare feet onto the freezing limestone. The fortress felt like a tomb. Rusted iron chains bolted directly into the stone walls replaced decorative banners, turning the royal corridors into a sprawling, lightless cage. Tracing the sharp, medicinal scent of crushed willow bark through the dark halls, she crept down a spiraling staircase. Cold drafts bit at her ankles. Pushing a splintered oak door open, she braced herself against the frame. Rows of iron cots filled the cavernous room. Sweating, scarred enforcers thrashed wildly against thick leather restraints. Gut-wrenching groans rattled the glass vials on nearby tables. Sickly yellow light bled from their feral eyes, illuminating the dark, roping veins creeping up their necks. The feral curse wasn't a myth. It was a rotting reality, and the scent of their decaying minds turned her stomach into a tight knot. Memories of her mother gentling a trapped rabbit in the winter snow anchored her racing pulse. Dignity and survival meant fixing what was broken, and the overwhelming urge to ease their suffering drowned out her own rising panic. Planting a foot on the floorboards, she angled toward the nearest thrashing soldier. A towering silhouette eclipsed the candlelight in the doorway. The agonizing groans of the dying men seemed to fade into a hollow static. Silas leaned against the oak frame, crossing thick arms over his chest, his breathing dragged in a slow, jagged rhythm. The tendons in his neck pulled taut. He ignored the dying warriors entirely, pinning his golden, unblinking stare directly on her face. He knew she hunted for herbs to hide her true scent. Calloused fingers wrapped firmly around her elbow. He didn't speak. He simply dragged her back into the freezing corridor before she could dissect any more of his rotting kingdom. Dragging her through the winding corridors, Silas marched her straight out the rear gates and into the brutal morning blizzard. Sleet pelted her bare cheeks like crushed glass. Releasing her arm, he stepped backward into the dead center of a packed snow training ring. "Fight me!" The rusted rumble vibrated through the soles of her boots. Stripped down to a dark combat shirt, jagged battle scars littered his exposed forearms. The cursed, black veins crawled up his throat like a parasitic web. Shaking her head, she dug her heels into the slush. "I don't know how to fight." He didn't care. Leather boots blurred across the ice. Silas swept his right leg out, hooking her ankles. Her spine hit the frozen earth with a bone-rattling crack. All the oxygen blasted out of her lungs. The howling wind faded to a high-pitched ring in her left ear. She swallowed a mouthful of metallic saliva, waiting for her vision to stop spinning before she even tried to move. Refusing to summon the royal beast, she dragged herself backward through the snowbanks. Exposing glowing white fur meant begging for a public execution. "Get up!" Liquid gold ignited in his eyes. "Your alpha called you weak. Prove him wrong." Tucking her knees to her ribs, she locked her arms around her shins. A strategic mind knew when to hold the line. "I said get up!" he roared, shaking loose snow from the pine branches. Her dormant beast clawed viciously at her throat, demanding a bloodbath. Biting her tongue until it bled, she slammed the spiritual cage shut, forcing the magic back into the dark. Silas closed the distance in 2 lethal strides. Swinging his flat palm, he aimed a brutal strike at her shoulder to force a defensive block. She didn't raise her hands. She braced for the impact. The blow connected with a sickening thud. The force launched her sideways, scraping her cheek violently against a jagged slab of ice. The wind suddenly died. A solitary raven cawed in the distant tree line. A bright drop of crimson blood dripped from her split lip, staining the pristine snow. Silas froze mid-stride, panting through her teeth. She pushed up onto one elbow. The unhinged madness in his eyes fractured instantly. He stared blankly at the scarlet drops on the ice. A violent shudder ripped through his broad shoulders, buckling his knees a fraction of an inch. He stared at her like he had just slaughtered an innocent animal. Before she could speak, he pivoted away. White-knuckling his fists until the skin tore, the warlord marched silently into the blinding whiteout, leaving her bleeding in the frost. Following her own blood trail back into the fortress, Evangeline navigated the labyrinth of freezing corridors until she located a small, deserted clinic near the kitchens. Dropping onto a rusted stool, she pressed a freezing, wet cloth firmly against her split lip. Raw pain throbbed behind her cheekbone. Warlords didn't break down over a minor bruise, yet the pure devastation in his golden eyes had been entirely real. He was terrified of his own hands. Wood splintered into 100 pieces as the clinic door ripped off its iron hinges. Glass apothecary jars rattled on their metal shelves. A hulking northern enforcer crashed into the room, knocking over a steel tray. Glass shattered across the floor tiles in a deafening crash. Black veins bulged against his temples. Yellow foam dripped from his chin onto his leather armor. Vacant, rabid eyes locked onto her sitting form. He lunged, claws extended. Survival instinct bypassed her dormant wolf. Dropping flat beneath his sweeping arm, she used his own forward momentum against him. Her fingers clamped around his thick wrist, twisting the joint inward. 10 years of studying anatomy textbooks provided a much sharper weapon than fangs. She calculated the exact angle. Driving her elbow downward, she struck the exposed nerve cluster directly behind his knee. The enforcer let out a gargled howl, buckling violently to the stone floor. The loud thud rattled the broken glass. Dust motes danced in the pale light filtering through the window. He thrashed against the debris, jaws snapping at the empty air. Instead of fleeing, she dropped to her knees beside his rabid face. Dignity required courage. Pressing 2 firm fingers against the throbbing carotid artery on his neck, she applied precise, restrictive pressure. "Shh," she murmured, her voice steady and rhythmic. "You are safe. The pain is ending. Just rest." Rotting teeth snapped a fraction of an inch from her forearm. She held her ground. Channeling absolute, unshakable calm, she maintained the pressure on his pulse point. His crazed eyes rolled back into his skull. The thrashing stopped. Raging breaths slowed into a deep, rhythmic snore. He was out cold. Releasing a jagged sigh, she wiped a bead of cold sweat from her brow. Intellectual dominance proved far more lethal than blind rage. The hairs on the back of her neck stood straight up. Pivoting on her knees, she looked toward the ruined doorway. Silas stood perfectly still among the splintered wood. The feral warlord stared at the unconscious giant on the floor, then dragged his golden eyes up to her face. He didn't see a broken healer anymore. He saw a queen. Stepping over the debris, Silas moved slowly into the room, his burning gaze entirely captivated by the woman who had just conquered a rabid monster with nothing but her bare hands. Dust motes hung suspended in the splintered doorway of the clinic. Silas stood perfectly still among the ruined wood, staring blindly at the unconscious enforcer before dragging his gaze to her trembling hands. The Northern King didn't look at a useless clinic scrub. He stared at a rival. A blaring brass horn shattered the quiet. The violent vibration traveled straight through the floorboards and rattled Evangeline's molars. Silas broke his stare instantly. The raw awe in his irises vanished, replaced by an empty, freezing fury. Pivoting on his heel, he sprinted down the winding corridor toward the main courtyard. Refusing to let her only shield out of her sight, she bolted after him. Her lungs burned as she scaled the spiraling stairs toward the upper gallery. Ducking behind a limestone pillar, she pressed her spine flat against the freezing rock. Playing hide-and-seek to survive felt exactly like being a hunted child again. Only the stakes involved entire packs burning to the ground. Down in the cavernous entry hall, the iron gates stood wide open. 3 southern messengers tracked slush across the pristine floor. Reeking of cheap cologne and arrogant entitlement, they stood dwarfed by the towering northern enforcers circling them. "Alpha Thorn demands the immediate return of his property," the lead messenger shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "Return the healer, Evangeline, or the South will march on this fortress by nightfall." Biting the inside of her cheek, she tasted iron. Thorn dragging his army into a blizzard over a 29-year-old outcast made zero logical sense. He didn't want a useless healer. He wanted a hidden asset. Leather boots clicked slowly against the grand staircase. Silas descended into the light. Stripped of his armor, the warlord radiated absolute, crushing violence. "Property?" The word scraped out of his throat, like rusted metal. Stalking toward the southern wolves, the muscles along his spine coiled tight. "She is my mate." His roar detonated in the center of the hall. "Tell Thorn if he steps 1 foot onto my snow, I will rip his spine from his throat." Plaster dusted down from the chandelier anchors. The messengers visibly flinched, shrinking under the suffocating pressure of his kinetic energy. Scrambling backward over the threshold, they bolted into the blizzard, leaving an agonizing tension vibrating in their wake. The wind howled through the open gates. No one moved. Instead of flexing his dominance, Silas reached out and locked his fingers around a thick oak table. He swayed, his boots scraping the stone. The roping black infection on his neck began to throb in a sickening, frantic rhythm. Jerking his chin up, the feral blackness swallowed the gold in his eyes entirely, dragging him into the rotting abyss right in front of his entire guard. Scraping her boots against the limestone, Evangeline scrambled down the stairs as Silas collapsed to his knees. Thick oak splintered into jagged shards beneath his grip. A wet, tearing snarl ripped from his lungs. Digging his fingers into his scalp, the king thrashed wildly against the rotting parasite eating his brain. "Stay back!" A scarred lieutenant drew his broadsword. "The king is turning!" Survival instinct screamed at her to run toward the open gates. Instead, her boots carried her directly into the center of the fray. Shoving past a towering enforcer, she skidded onto the icy floorboards. Silas slashed blindly at the ambient air. Extended lethal claws gouged deep trenches into the polished marble. His broad shoulders spasmed violently, losing the war inside his own skull. Dropping to her knees directly in his path, she ignored the snapping jaws hovering inches from her collarbone. Thrusting a hand into her wool pocket, her fingers closed around the cold glass vial of black wolfsbane. Her daily dose. Skipping the poison meant unlocking the royal cage. Exposing the ancient Lycan blood guaranteed a death sentence from every corrupt alpha alive. She stared at the agonizing torture twisting his features. Pulling the glass vial from her coat, she slammed it violently against the floorboards. Glass shattered. Black sludge pooled uselessly into the grout lines. Trading her anonymity for his sanity, she let the poison burn away. Her dormant beast finally shattered its frigid cage. A blinding shockwave of ancient, dominant magic blasted through her veins. The stagnant air instantly flooded with the scent of crushed pine needles and lightning. Royal magic commanded obedience, projecting a rich, suffocating blanket of absolute calm over the room. Reaching through the dangerous space between them, she planted her bare hands directly onto his burning cheeks. "Look at me," she ordered, her voice a sharp, melodic blade. "Come back to me." The thrashing ceased the second her skin touched his. The rotting blackness retreated, draining out of his corneas to reveal fractured, burning gold. Taking a jagged, rattling breath, his chest collided violently with hers. He froze, staring at her face like she was a ghost. Inhaling the potent air, he didn't smell a terrified clinic worker. He tasted the undeniable, raw power of the lost Lycan bloodline, the exact cure his rotting kingdom needed. Without a single word of defiance, the feral warlord slumped forward, burying his face directly into the curve of her neck and surrendering his rabid beast to her unyielding grip. Ambient cold seeped through the floorboards, chilling Evangeline's knees as the raw burst of Lycan magic slowly settled into the stonework. Silas refused to move. Kneeling on the cracked marble, his face remained buried in her sweater. He inhaled her scent in deep, desperate drags, treating her pulse point like oxygen. Calloused fingers clamped tightly around her waist, anchoring him to reality. "You're a Lycan," he rasped against her skin. The rusted edge of his voice cracked. Her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A decade of toxic sludge and hiding in the shadows unraveled in 60 seconds. The potent scent of her royal heritage coated the entire room. "I am," she whispered. A single, scalding tear broke over her eyelashes. Tilting his head back, his rough thumbs caught the moisture on her cheek. The motion was startlingly precise. "Why were you hiding it? You are royalty. You are a queen." The dam finally broke. "When I was 19, she choked out, her voice vibrating with old, rotting terror. "Thorn discovered my parents' bloodline. He didn't just kill them, he drained them." Swallowing a sob, she stared blindly at the splintered table. "He harvested their blood to mutate his own warriors. I hid inside a hollow, rotting tree. I watched them bleed out in the snow. I drank the poison every single morning so he couldn't smell me, so I wouldn't be his next blood bag." Sharing the ugly truth left her entirely hollowed out. Bracing for his pity, she waited for the warlord to view her as a traumatized, broken liability. Silas offered exactly zero pity. Protective, Unhinged rage ignited in his golden irises. The ambient temperature in the room plummeted. Frost crept across the edges of the marble tiles. The puzzle pieces clicked together. Thorn wasn't risking an army for pride. He was hunting for a royal blood supply. Standing up in one fluid motion, Silas dragged her to her feet with him. Reaching down, he slid a jagged silver dagger from his boot sheath. He dragged the sharp edge straight across his own palm. Bright crimson blood dripped onto the white stone. "I swear it on the moon," Silas roared, the dark frequency vibrating through the frozen walls. "I will march south. I will burn his walls to the ground. And I will personally rip Thorn's heart from his chest for every single tear you have cried." Blood pooled on the marble as she stared up at the lethal warlord, realizing the most dangerous monster in the world was entirely willing to slaughter a continent just to keep her breathing. Dragged up the spiraling stone stairs and pressed flat against a mattress, Evangeline finally began to burn. 10 years of toxic sludge saturated her marrow. Ripping the wolfsbane out of her system felt exactly like swallowing liquid fire. Frost clung to the window panes, but the gray furs beneath her were completely drenched in cold sweat. She needed to bleed it out. Sitting perfectly still beside the mattress, Silas gripped a wet linen cloth. He dragged the cool fabric across her burning forehead. The tendons in his neck pulled taut against his skin. Memories of a poisoned pup seizing in the southern mud flashed behind her eyelids. Holding that dying boy had left her feeling entirely helpless. Now, the agony belonged strictly to her. Her spine arched violently off the mattress. A wet, tearing sound ripped from her throat. Her dormant beast slammed against the rotting cage inside her mind, fighting to break free. It shredded her lungs from the inside out. "Shh," Silas rumbled. The rusted frequency vibrated directly into her collarbone. "I am right here. Let it out." Abandoning the linen cloth, the warlord climbed directly onto the bed. She gravitated toward his radiating heat on pure instinct. Scarred arms wrapped firmly around her trembling ribs, pulling her flush against his chest. He acted as a physical anchor in a raging hurricane. Crushed winter pine slammed into her sinuses, shoving the metallic stench of the poison away. Burying her face into the crook of his neck, her teeth chattered hard enough to chip enamel. Every single bone in her body felt like it was splintering. The fire spiked higher. The long, brutal night stretched into an endless cycle of pain, leaving her terrified that a decade of poison had permanently crippled the royal magic before it could even wake. Morning sunlight pierced the frosted glass, dragging Evangeline out of the burning dark. Peeling her eyelids open required a monumental effort. Her limbs felt completely drained, scraped hollow by the violent fever. Yet, beneath her bruised ribs, a lethal beauty was finally awake. The ancient Lycan beast stretched its spectral claws inside her chest. Every single nerve ending instantly ignited, screaming for her mate. Her true, uncaged scent flooded the warm air. A potent wave of ancient forest and wild lightning coated the walls. A sharp intake of breath fractured the quiet room. Silas lay perfectly still beside her. Stripped to the waist, the rotting black veins on his throat were completely gone. Her royal proximity had purged the feral curse from his blood while they slept. Golden irises tracked her face, glowing with a starving hunger. "Evangeline." The words scraped out of his throat like a rusted blade. Dust motes drifted in the beam of sunlight striking the footboard. The silence stretched. She evaluated his lethal frame, finding exactly zero fear inside her own mind. Reaching across the pillows, he gently cupped her jaw. A calloused thumb dragged softly across her bottom lip. "You survived," he rasped. He bridged the gap. The collision of their mouths offered zero polite restraint. It was a desperate strike of two feral souls finding absolute grounding. The kiss tasted of salt, raw relief, and burning heat. Tangling her fingers into the hair at the nape of his neck, she pulled him closer. A dark, vibrating hum rattled out of his chest and against her mouth. He shifted his weight, pressing her securely into the mattress. Fire ignited beneath her skin as the mating bond snapped into place. It seared a permanent, invisible brand directly onto her racing heart, locking the northern warlord entirely to her soul. Then, a blaring brass horn shattered the peace. The frantic war horn tore the ambient silence to shreds. It wasn't a warning blast. It was a desperate cry for backup. Evangeline shoved her palms against Silas's chest. The gentle lover vanished in a blur of motion. Rolling off the mattress, the lethal king hit the floorboards. Leather straps cracked as he secured a broadsword to his bare back. The Southern Army. He stared at the frosted window. Murder entirely eclipsed the gold in his eyes. They are breaching the outer walls. Throwing the furs aside, Evangeline planted her bare feet on the freezing stone. She needed claws. She needed teeth. Digging deep into her chest, she ordered her newly awakened beast to shift her bones. Nothing happened. Her lungs seized. She squeezed her eyes shut and forced the magic forward. The royal wolf whimpered blindly in the dark. 10 years of toxic cage had left the beast completely atrophied. It possessed the magic, but it lacked the physical strength to transform. Trapped inside a fragile human shell, she stared at her pale, trembling hands. I can't shift. Tears of pure frustration burned her tear ducts. Silas, I can't shift. Thorn's cruel laughter echoed in her ears, mocking her uselessness. Crossing the room in 2 strides, Silas clamped his hands over her shoulders. The grip bruised her skin. Listen to me, he ordered, his voice slicing through her rising panic. You are not broken. You are healing. Stay in this room. Lock the iron door. No! She grabbed his forearms. Thorn pumped them full of harvested blood. They are unnatural. They will kill you. Yanking her flush against his ribs, he pressed a bruising kiss to her forehead. I cannot die. I have you to come back to. He pivoted on his heel and sprinted through the doorway. The thick oak slammed shut. The echo vibrated in her teeth. Racing to the window pane, she scraped the frost away with her fingernails. Down in the courtyard, hundreds of southern warriors swarmed over the retaining walls. Sickly red light bled from their eyes. They moved with unnatural, mutated speed. Silas crashed directly into their front line, his broadsword severing limbs in a blur of steel. But the sheer volume of mutated bodies instantly swallowed his towering frame. Slamming her fists against the frozen glass, the Lycan queen watched the slaughter unfold, trapped in a high tower while the monsters tore the only man she loved to pieces. Watching the only shield you possess get ripped apart is a very specific, rotting kind of hell. Evangeline planted both palms against the freezing glass. Frost melted beneath her skin. Down in the courtyard, crimson stained the pristine snowbanks. Silas operated like a machine of pure violence. The broadsword flashed in silver arcs, severing limbs and dropping bodies. Yet the corrupted southern horde poured over the retaining walls in an endless, writhing wave. Crushing helplessness choked the oxygen from her lungs. It felt exactly like being 7 years old again, digging her bleeding fingernails into a fallen oak tree, completely unable to lift the crushing weight off her dying mother's chest. Standing behind reinforced glass, she was exactly that powerless again. Her dormant beast slammed its spectral claws against her ribs, demanding to shift, demanding to fight. Trapped in a frail human shell, she could do nothing but watch. The chaos below fractured. Alpha Thorn breached the splintered main gates. He didn't engage the front line. Cowardice kept him hidden behind his mutated enforcers. Gripping an iron spear, the jagged tip dripped with a viscous, black sludge. Concentrated wolfsbane. Before her brain could process the threat, Thorn hurled the weapon directly through the melee. Snow fell in agonizing slow motion. Distracted by 3 lunging wolves, Silas twisted. The iron spear struck his bare shoulder. It drove straight through the muscle, burying the poisoned tip deep against his collarbone. A guttural, agonizing roar ripped from the warlord's throat. It wasn't the impact. It was the lethal shock of pure poison detonating inside his royal veins. Grasping the iron shaft, he yanked the spear free, but the black sludge had already entered his bloodstream. The northern king staggered backward. His broadsword hit the blood-soaked ice with a dull thud. Fire detonated inside Evangeline's chest. The mating bond transmitted the agony instantly. Searing pain erupted across her own shoulder blade. Her knees buckled, sending her crashing onto the floorboards. The poison attacked his heart, and she felt his frantic, powerful pulse begin to skip and stutter inside her own ribs. Scraping her fingernails against the stone, she watched the southern horde swarm their fallen king, dragging her only salvation straight into the bloody slush. Iron hinges shrieked as the great hall doors blew open. 4 northern lieutenants dragged Silas's dead weight across the threshold. A thick smear of black blood painted the polished marble behind them. Evangeline sprinted down the spiraling stairs, her boots slipping on the stone. "Put him on the table!" Her voice cracked like a whip. The enforcers hoisted the warlord onto the splintered oak dining table. His skin was the color of ash. Blue tinted his lips. The roping, infected veins on his neck throbbed violently, pumping the lethal wolfsbane directly toward his heart. Dropping to her knees, she ripped her medical bag open. Her fingers trembled violently. Metal scissors clattered against the floor tiles. Grabbing a roll of sterile gauze, she packed the gaping wound, throwing her entire body weight into the pressure. Crimson soaked through the white fabric in less than a second. "Stay with me!" Tears hit his freezing chest. "Silas, don't you dare close your eyes." She threaded a needle. She poured rubbing alcohol directly into the torn muscle. 10 years of clinic training proved entirely useless. Wolfsbane, designed to slaughter a Lycan, ignored standard sutures. His chest hitched. Golden irises rolled backward, revealing the whites of his eyes. His pulse vanished beneath her blood-slicked fingers. Dropping the bloody gauze, she squeezed her eyes shut. She dragged her consciousness downward, screaming at the royal beast to wake up, to shift, to heal him. The mental cage remained completely silent. The fever had burned away the beast's remaining strength. An amplified voice boomed across the courtyard, vibrating the stained glass windows. "Evangeline!" Thorn's cruel taunt sliced through the hall. "Your king is dead. My army surrounds the keep. Come out and surrender your royal blood, or I will slaughter every single person left inside these walls." The remaining northern guards drew their swords, exchanging terrified glances. They were completely surrounded. Staring at her crimson-stained hands, the brutal truth clicked into place. She wasn't a queen. She was a fractured liability who brought executioners to the only people who tried to protect her. The silence inside the great hall stretched until it snapped. Dropping her chin, Evangeline rested her forehead against Silas's freezing knuckles. The mating bond inside her chest felt entirely hollow, like standing in an empty room with the windows blown out. He was dying. Running away 10 years ago had only delayed the inevitable. Her royal blood was a rotting curse that infected everyone it touched. The terror of living without him warred against the guilt of watching innocent northern pups get slaughtered to protect her secret. Dignity demanded a sacrifice. Memories of the poisoned pup in the southern mud grounded her panic. She couldn't save Silas with herbs, but she could take the pain away from the rest of the pack. She pushed off the floorboards. Wiping her blood-soaked hands down the front of her ruined sweater, she turned toward the lieutenants guarding the barricade. "Open the gates," she ordered, her voice completely stripped of emotion. The guards stared at her, their swords lowering a fraction of an inch. "My queen, we cannot!" "Open them!" She didn't yell. The quiet command cut straight through the tension. "I am the asset he wants. If I give him my blood, he leaves. I am surrendering." Her boots felt like lead weights. Walking out into the snow meant returning to the cage, but this time, Thorn would drain her dry before morning. A sharp scrape of leather against oak broke the silence. She froze. A calloused, freezing hand locked around her left wrist. Spinning around, her pulse hammered against her throat. Silas remained flat on his back. Black sludge leaked from the corner of his pale lips. His eyes remained glassy and unfocused. Yet, his grip on her wrist felt like a steel vice. He refused to let her pull away. No. The rusted syllable bubbled up through the blood in his throat, carrying the absolute, unyielding authority of a warlord. The hollow bond inside her chest flickered with a faint, stubborn pulse. Staring at the dying king, she realized the most dangerous man on the continent was using his final heartbeat to physically chain her to the fight, refusing to let her surrender to the monsters waiting in the dark. Utter silence crushed the great hall. The ambient hum of the castle felt completely hollowed out. Evangeline knelt on the freezing marble, staring blindly at her trembling hands. The thick, dark blood of the Northern King coated her skin up to her wrists. Deep inside her chest, the mating bond flickered erratically, fading like a dying ember in a downpour. Crushing despair anchored her knees to the stone. Logic dictated a simple, brutal choice. Walk into the snow and surrender to Thorn, or watch the entire pack get slaughtered in their beds. A sharp scrape of leather against the table broke the quiet. Calloused, freezing fingers locked like a steel vice around her wrist. Her lungs seized. Silas lay flat against the splintered oak. Black sludge pooled at the corner of his pale lips. His golden irises were glassy and unfocused, rapidly losing the war against the wolfsbane. Yet, the grip he held on her arm possessed the unyielding, kinetic strength of a warlord. He was dying on a ruined dining table, and he absolutely refused to let her sacrifice herself. No? The rusted syllable bubbled up through the blood in his throat. Tension snapped the ambient air. He flexed his wrist, violently dragging her closer until her chin hovered inches from his chest. Gritting his teeth against the searing agony of the poison, he forced his failing eyes to focus directly on hers. "You are a queen," Silas choked out, the dark frequency vibrating against her collarbone. "You do not surrender." Her heart hammered against her ribs. The urge to flee, to hide in the root system of a hollow tree, warred with the absolute terrifying conviction in his gaze. He was perfectly willing to bleed out right here just to ensure she finally stood tall. The weight of his belief felt like an anvil. If she surrendered to Thorn now, the ancient Lycan power sleeping in her marrow would rot away in a cage. She would die exactly how Thorn viewed her, as a coward. Memories of a moth diving directly into a campfire flared in her mind. It didn't burn immediately. It glowed with a blinding, incandescent light before the ash took it. Fire etched itself into her veins. Answering his dying command required zero hesitation. She blinked the moisture from her eyes. Reaching out with bloody fingers, she gently pried his iron grip off her wrist. Pressing a soft kiss to his scarred knuckles, she inhaled the fading scent of crushed pine needles, anchoring his scent deep into her marrow. Planting her boots flat on the floorboards, Evangeline stood up. She bypassed the servant corridors entirely. She ignored the hidden cellar tunnels. Locking her gaze onto the reinforced oak barricades of the great hall, she calculated the distance. His pulse skipped again. Time was bleeding out. The terrified, trembling healer shattered completely on the frozen marble. Tucking her fear away, the dormant beast inside her mind stretched its spectral limbs. Taking a deliberate step toward the main gates, she left the dying warlord on the table and marched directly toward the slaughter. Leather soles slapped a rhythmic, measured cadence against the freezing limestone. Evangeline walked down the exact center of the great hall. Dozens of terrified northern enforcers scrambled backward, parting like a physical wave to clear her path. Scraped hollow by the battle, they stared at her with wide, panicked eyes. The scent in the room violently shifted. The metallic tang of fear and bitter poison completely evaporated. Ozone and the crackle of incoming lightning flooded the stagnant air. The royal beast inside her mind was no longer whimpering. 10 years of rusted, toxic iron snapped apart as the wolf aggressively threw its spiritual weight against her ribs. It demanded a bloodbath. It demanded retribution. Accepting the crown meant accepting the violence. Ancient, dormant magic reached a boiling point inside her veins, turning her blood to liquid fire. Thorn's amplified voice rattled the stained glass windows from the exterior courtyard. "I will count to 10, the Southern Alpha roared, dripping with arrogant entitlement. "And then my army will slaughter the pups first." Biting the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, she focused her vision. Memories of white snow turning crimson 10 years ago fueled the fire. A mediocre, cowardly monster dictating the fate of a continent ended today. Reaching the iron handles of the main gates, she planted her feet shoulder-width apart. The tremor in her hands vanished entirely. "Open the gates." Her command cut through the hall with absolute, undeniable alpha authority. The hulking northern guards hesitated for a fraction of a second. Gripping the heavy iron chains, the enforcers threw their combined weight backward. Iron hinges shrieked. A wall of sub-zero wind blasted through the expanding gap, stinging her cheeks with sleet. The deafening roar of the bloody melee violently crashed into the quiet hall. Stepping over the threshold, Evangeline walked out of the dark keep. Unarmed and wearing a blood-soaked wool sweater, she stood at the top of the stone stairs, dwarfed by the hundreds of mutated, towering wolves swarming the courtyard. The chaotic battleground to an immediate halt. As if connected to a single hive mind, every rabid eye snapped toward her small silhouette. Safely hidden behind a wall of corrupted meat shields, Thorn sneered. Arrogance radiated off him in waves. He assumed he had broken the keep. He assumed she was walking out to beg for the lives of the pups. Raising the poisoned iron spear, he pointed the bloody tip directly at her sternum. She didn't flinch. She didn't drop her chin. Squaring her shoulders against the blizzard, she stared directly into the dead eyes of the man who had slaughtered her family. Dark storm clouds violently eclipsed the sun, plunging the courtyard into shadow as the clinic worker vanished forever, clearing the path for a queen entirely prepared to burn the world to the ground. A heavy, suffocating static clamped down on the courtyard. Hundreds of corrupted southern wolves froze mid-strike. Dropping the torn limbs of the northern guard, they pivoted their glowing, unnatural red eyes toward the icy staircase. Thorn stood in the epicenter of the carnage, resting the shaft of his poisoned spear against his hip. "Evangeline!" The disgusting, mocking laugh carried easily over the wind. "The pathetic, useless healer finally comes out to die." The wind died completely. She didn't blink. 10 years ago, that exact laugh would have sent her scrambling into the root system of a hollow oak. Today, it acted as the final spark to a powder keg. "I am not a healer today," she murmured, the sound lost to the sleet. Tilting her chin back toward the raging storm clouds, she released the lock on the spiritual cage. She let the magic detonate. The physical shift was a visceral, violent explosion. Femurs cracked. Muscle fibers tore and rapidly reknit. The agonizing, bone-crushing pain was incredibly euphoric. She felt her frail human anatomy ripping apart at the seams to make room for the apex predator beneath. Wool shredded into confetti as blinding, pure white fur erupted violently from her spine. Her physical mass expanded, stretching taller and broader until she shadowed the stairs. Her jaw elongated into a lethal snout filled with razor-sharp canines. This wasn't a standard wolf transformation. The truth unraveled in front of the paralyzed army. She manifested as a towering, majestic Lycan, easily matching Silas in sheer mass. Her heavy paws cracked the limestone steps beneath her weight. The fur covering her body was as stark and blinding as a fresh avalanche. Opening her eyes, the irises didn't glow with alpha gold. They burned with a radiant, divine silver light that physically scorched the retinas of anyone who looked directly at her. Thorn's grip failed. The poisoned spear clattered uselessly into the bloody snow. his jaw unhinged in absolute paralyzed horror. A guttural vibration started deep inside her expanded chest cavity. It traveled down her legs and into the bedrock, physically vibrating the mountain range. Unlocking her massive jaws, she dragged in a lungful of sub-zero air. She unleashed a deafening, earth-shattering howl. The kinetic sound wave visibly warped the air as it blasted across the courtyard. Thick ice shattered off the retaining walls. Sleet violently blew backward off the pine branches. Carrying pure, concentrated ancient magic, the frequency slammed into the corrupted southern horde. It acted like a physical blow, stripping the harvested feral mutation directly out of their bloodstreams. Dozens of unnatural wolves instantly buckled into the slush, whimpering as the artificial control completely short-circuited. The echo faded into the mountains, leaving a crushing silence in its wake. Thorn stumbled backward over a corpse, absolute terror permanently etched into his face. The towering white wolf didn't rush. Taking deliberate, ground-shaking steps down the icy stairs, she locked her burning silver eyes onto the alpha, methodically preparing to tear his throat entirely out of his neck. Blood soaked into the snowpack, turning the pristine courtyard into a butcher's floor. Tearing a tyrant's throat out required far more than razor-sharp canines. It demanded a calloused, fractured heart. Striking the ice with kinetic force, Evangeline didn't sprint like a mindless predator. She hunted. Silver irises tracked Thorn through the blizzard. 10 years of studying anatomical charts dictated her exact trajectory. She targeted the weak cartilage, the exposed arteries, and the fragile joints designed to break. Scrambling backward in the slush, Thorn fumbled inside his wool coat. A humming artifact emerged from his pocket. The metallic container pulsed with a stolen, sickly magic. Baring her elongated fangs, she calculated the distance to his throat. He aimed the artifact at the churning atmosphere, his lips parting to scream an incantation. Wood splintered into shrapnel as the oak doors exploded outward. A dark silhouette violently eclipsed the snowfall. Silas, the warlord breathed. Purified by the blinding shockwave of ancient Lycan magic, his royal heart had successfully incinerated the wolfsbane. Landing in the center of the fray, the king unleashed absolute carnage. Fur and steel collided, while Silas systematically dismantled the remaining guard with brutal kinetic force. Evangeline vaulted directly toward Thorn. She ignored his exposed neck. Bypassing his defenses, she applied her clinical precision. Crushing her jaws around his right knee, she snapped the joint backward. Pivoting on the ice, she severed his left Achilles tendon with a single swipe of her claws. The alpha collapsed, face first into the freezing slush. Planting her paw squarely on his spine, she pinned him to the bedrock. She stared down at the architect of her 10-year nightmare. Dignity required closing the wound permanently. Flanking her blind spot, Silas stepped into her peripheral vision. Dark blood dripped from his elongated jaw. A vibrating, rhythmic hum rattled in his chest. Snapping her jaws shut, Evangeline crushed Thorn's cervical vertebrae, completely severing his reign of terror. The humming artifact slipped from his limp fingers. It rolled across the crimson ice, clinking softly against a frozen stone to remind them that surviving the battle was only the first step of a much longer war. Following the fatal crack of Thorn's spine, the howling blizzard rapidly lost its momentum. The wind died, leaving a suffocating static in the air. Evangeline released the ruined corpse. Stepping backward, her silver gaze locked onto the pulsing artifact half buried in the slush. Survival demanded eradicating every trace of his poison. Raising her right paw, she drove her full weight down onto the metal casing. Metal yielded with a sharp, echoing crunch. Glass shattered. A brilliant cloud of stolen Lycan magic violently decompressed, scattering into the atmosphere like powdered diamonds. The stolen essence of her bloodline finally dissolved into the freezing air, allowed to rest in absolute peace. Adrenaline immediately abandoned her bloodstream. The towering beast began to fracture. Bones popped and realigned with agonizing friction. Pristine fur dissolved into bare skin. Collapsing onto her knees in the red snow, Evangeline dragged ragged gasps of freezing oxygen into her burning lungs. Violent shivers completely wrecked her frame. Scraping boots approached from behind. Silas had already discarded his wolf form. Ignoring the blood and the biting frost, he snatched a discarded cloak from the courtyard steps. He dropped onto his knees beside her, wrapping the thick wool tightly around her trembling shoulders. "I've got you," Silas rasped. The rusted frequency of his voice fractured completely. "I've got you." Burying her face into the crook of his neck, she swallowed the metallic taste of copper coating her tongue. He smelled of sweat, pine needles, and raw survival. 10 years of calculated resilience finally broke, leaking out of her eyes in silent tears. Lifting her chin to drag in another breath, the scene unfolding in the courtyard forced her lungs to freeze. Dozens of northern lieutenants were dropping to one knee. Beside them, the cured southern enforcers mirrored the gesture. Hundreds of scarred, lethal warriors bowed their heads to the quiet healer who had weaponized her empathy to save a continent. "Queen Evangeline!" A northern enforcer roared into the quiet. The title echoed against the limestone walls, repeated by 100 rough voices. Silas dragged his thumbs across her dirty cheekbones. The feral veins were permanently erased from his throat. Staring into his burning irises, the final fragment of her trauma dissolved. True resilience didn't require hiding in the shadows. It meant standing in the light, displaying every ugly scar, and commanding respect anyway. Leaning into the frost, he captured her mouth in front of the kneeling army, promising an unbreakable devotion before the true political war for the continent began. 3 months of relentless thaw finally washed the remaining blood from the courtyard stones. The northern keep traded rusted chains for open windows, letting the scent of roasted venison and blooming wildflowers chase the damp chill from the corridors. Standing before a polished mirror in the royal quarters, Evangeline studied her reflection. Cool silk pooled around her bare ankles. Reaching up, she traced the jagged scar bisecting her collarbone. She no longer viewed the marred tissue as a defect. It represented pure emotional resilience, a permanent receipt of the hell she had survived to buy her crown. Floorboards creaked behind her. Thick, scarred arms banded around her ribs. Silas pulled her spine flush against his bare chest, burying his face into the curve of her neck. He inhaled the scent of pine and lightning anchoring her skin. A territorial hum vibrated against her vocal cords. "My queen," he murmured, his voice steeped in a suffocating heat. Her pulse skipped a beat. Leaning her weight entirely into his solid frame, she tilted her head back. "The coronation ceremony lasted for hours," she breathed, catching his lower lip with her own. "Then let me enforce a mandatory rest." His response was a rusted growl. Pivoting her on her bare feet, the golden fire in his eyes burned with unyielding obsession. He hoisted her off the floorboards, carrying her effortlessly toward the sprawling mattress. Setting her against the pillows with startling precision, his mouth tracked a burning path down her jawline. Surviving absolute agony together forged an electric connection. Every brush of his calloused fingers sent a lethal current straight into her marrow. Tangling her hands in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, she dragged him flush against her chest. "You are so beautiful," Silas rasped against her mouth. "Mine. Always mine. Always," she answered, her voice a fractured whisper. Skin flushed with heat, the northern warlord completely yielded his feral heart to the tactical survivor who had dismantled his curse. When dawn finally crested the mountain peaks, Evangeline took her seat beside Silas in the grand hall. Surveying the unified pack, the bitter taste of wolfsbane was nothing but a ghost. The broken bird owned the entire sky. Threading her fingers through her mate's scarred hand, she tightened her grip, leaning forward on the throne as the iron gates cracked open to reveal their very first challengers of the new era.